Why get a 144Hz monitor when you can have this? It's a 240Hz IPS that can be had for not much more money than some of the 144Hz offerings. So is the step up in refresh rate actually worth it? Or did AOC had to cut too many corners to offer a 240Hz IPS at this price point? Now, but before we get any deeper, we need to talk about the different variants that exist from this monitor. Because AOC came up with pretty confusing model names here, and chances are that you end up buying a totally different monitor if you don't pay close attention to the exact model name. AOC provided the monitor for the purpose of this review, but they don't get any input on this video's production, and everything I say reflects my own and honest opinion. Now, as I said in the intro, AOC did a terrible job naming their monitor lineup. I have the 24G2ZU here, which is not to be confused with the 24G2Z without a U, because the non-U version is a very different monitor that has a TN panel instead of an IPS. If you're somewhat familiar with AOC's naming scheme, this will be very confusing to you, because the U appendix for AOC usually only means that this monitor has a USB hub. And in fact, the U version actually has a USB hub, and the non-U version has no USB hub, but don't let that distract you from the fact that these two are totally different monitors altogether. The actual feature-reduced counterpart to the 24G2ZU is the 24G2ZE, which is supposed to be the same monitor without an USB hub and without an adjustable stand. To make matters worse, there are two different versions of the older 144Hz 24G2 that aren't even labeled as different versions. But I already talked at length about that in a different video that I will link in the top right corner. I honestly think AOC couldn't have made this much more confusing, so please pay close attention to the model names so that you don't end up accidentally buying the wrong monitor. I'll do my best to have them linked down below, but please double check before buying. Now, as I said, we're looking at the 240Hz IPS version here that has all the features, including a USB hub and an adjustable stand. And here you can see the other most important specs. From the outside, this monitor probably looks very familiar to most of you, because it's identical to the extremely popular 24G2U without a Z. In fact, I could easily just have used my old B-roll that I still got from that review, but what you're seeing right now actually is new footage of the Z version. But I guess you just have to take my word for it. Now, I really don't want to talk much about the outside of this monitor, because I covered that in my videos about the 144Hz versions already. Overall, the design and plastic construction are really nothing special, but they get the job done. I do appreciate the ergonomic stand, which offers tons of adjustment range in pretty much every direction and angle, including swivel and pivot. However, I'm still not a big fan of the red plastic, and I absolutely hate the cluttered OSD menu and the mushy buttons that I used for navigation. This still are the same buttons and menu that the non-Z versions have as well, which is rather disappointing. And I'm confident that this still are the same crappy speakers that fire out of the rear of the monitor, even though I don't have the non-Z versions for a direct comparison. So basically the only thing that has changed over the non-Z versions is the new 240Hz panel. The factory menu tells us that this is a MV238 FHM series panel from BOE. Now, a weakness of this panel clearly is its contrast. I've measured a contrast ratio of just over 700:1, which clearly is below average for an IPS panel. So movies and dark content in general don't look too appealing on this monitor, which I think is acceptable for a monitor like this. I mean, we're looking at a budget 240Hz monitor, which's primary focus is high refresh rate gaming. And a contrast ratio of about 700:1 clearly is enough to have no disadvantage in first-person shooters. Now, on the downside, IPS glow and backlight bleed generally are more visible with lower contrast panels, simply because the black level is higher. I was lucky to get a 24G2ZU with a pretty uniform backlight, apart from a brighter spot at the bottom right where the status LED is located. The rest of the brighter areas are mainly due to IPS glow, as you can see when I move the monitor. If we compare the exaggerated exposure to the original 24G2 that was popular for its good contrast, it becomes pretty clear that twice the contrast ratio just looks way better. Now, the maximum brightness level really leaves no room for criticism. Roughly 350 nits will be bright enough for most rooms. And on the low end, 71 nits really is a pretty solid minimum brightness. I still wish AOC would give us slightly more adjustment range here though. Now, I also wish that this was a wide gamut monitor, but unfortunately, it's not. The 24G2U is almost a textbook example of a standard gamut monitor with an sRGB coverage of just shy of 100% and an overall color gamut volume of just 105% of sRGB. Of course, that comes with the benefit that colors won't look oversaturated, neither the content you're watching in a web browser nor games. Though for gaming, especially first-person shooters, many people, including myself, actually prefer wide gamut monitors because in many cases the oversaturation improves visibility in-game. But the 24G2ZU is in good company as other first-person shooter-focused monitors like the Zowie XL2411K or Omen X25 are standard gamut displays as well. Now, when it comes to color accuracy, the 24G2ZU really benefits from its reasonable color gamut volume. Without changing a single setting, it manages to score a terrific delta E when being tested against sRGB. Yes, the white point is a bit off and the overall color temperature is slightly too warm, but that's something we can correct pretty easily. Once the white point is corrected, we get very good results. Of course, a full calibration will improve this even further. Now, AOC also provides us with an sRGB mode, but considering that this monitor doesn't have a larger than sRGB color gamut to begin with, I really wonder why they even bothered. And they really shouldn't have included this mode, to be honest, because it doesn't improve the color accuracy at all. Instead, it only blocks a bunch of settings, including the RGB sliders and most importantly, the brightness control. So it makes absolutely no sense at all to use this mode. Instead, I recommend using these settings unless you have access to a colorimeter. I will also link the ICC profile in the video description, which you can use in conjunction with these settings. In case you don't know how to apply an ICC, check the guide that I've linked in the top right corner. Now, while accurate colors are always nice to have, this after all is a 240Hz monitor. So the main attraction, of course, is the smoothness and responsiveness that comes with this refresh rate. And the fact that we get this at a relatively affordable price point, actually for a similar price that some of the 144Hz monitors retail for. While this is pretty amazing, keep in mind that 240Hz is not a massive step up from 144Hz. It's a much smaller gain in smoothness and responsiveness than going from 60 to 120Hz, for instance. So in case you're expecting a totally different gaming experience than at 144Hz, you probably will be disappointed. For me, one of the main benefits of 240Hz is having a larger adaptive sync range. So there's a larger variety of games that I can play at the maximum refresh rate that my PC can handle without needing to cap the FPS to stay inside the refresh rate range. Even with uncapped FPS, tearing is less noticeable with a higher refresh rate, so that's another benefit of more hertz. But as I said, I'm a big fan of adaptive sync, and thus I'm pretty happy that the 24G2ZU has a flawless adaptive sync implementation. I couldn't provoke any flickering or anything like that, even when doing my usual stress test, which the original 24G2 actually failed. Now, for some reason, the NVIDIA control panel shows the monitor is not validated as G-Sync compatible, whereas the NVIDIA website does. As the G-Sync performance is flawless, I assume the information that the control panel has is wrong, and the monitor actually passed NVIDIA's validation process. Now, when it comes to pixel response times, the 24G2ZU isn't the fastest monitor I've tested, but it's really no slouch either. To have a closer look, we'll of course use Blurbuster's pursued camera technique. Now, the OSD provides us with 4 different overdrive modes to choose from. But yeah, these modes obviously look almost identical. At the very least, they're identical enough that it's virtually impossible to see any differences between them in actual games. But just for the peace of mind, I'd go with the strong setting here. I also checked whether disabling adaptive sync changes the overdrive behavior, but it does not. Now, fortunately, AOC did tune the overdrive quite well, which is pretty crucial given the lack of manual control. At 144Hz, we also get a very well-rounded image with no visible overshoot or meaningful ghosting either. Really, the overdrive setting even is better optimized for 144Hz than for 240. 120Hz also looks very clean, which is good news in case you're planning to plug in your console. The same is true for 60 Hz, so AOC managed to make a single overdrive setting work throughout the refresh rate range, which is always nice to see. Now, but let's pull up some other monitors for comparison. The Omen X25 still is the fastest monitor I've tested, and I think that shows in this comparison. Don't get me wrong though, the 24G2ZU performs nicely, but take a look at how much clearer the outlines of the little alien are with the X25. That's an area where TN panels still have the upper hand even over fast IPS panels. The IPS panel of the AW2721D actually looks pretty similar to the AOC in that regard, but Alienware did a better job optimizing the overdrive. The AW2721D really doesn't show any smearing at the trailing edge of the UFO, whereas the AOC does show some slight ghosting. Now, the Gigabyte G24F is just a 170 Hz monitor, but this also has a better optimized overdrive than the 24G2ZU. Of course, the AOC still shows less motion blur thanks to its higher refresh rate, so overall the image looks a bit sharper. Now, when we're leveling the playing field and compare them all at 144 Hz, the AOC and Gigabyte begin to look extremely similar. AOC did a slightly better job with the overdrive at 144 Hz than at 240 Hz, so the 24G2ZU is now very evenly matched with the G24F. Now, I'm sure many of you are curious how the 24G2ZU stacks up against the 144 Hz non-Z versions. Well, at 144 Hz, the Z model looks extremely similar to the second version of the 24G2, which unfortunately has been discontinued. The first version obviously shows a bit more smearing at the trailing edge. At 240 Hz, the Z version shows less motion blur than the other two, which really is no surprise. So apart from the higher refresh rate, the Z version is closer to the second version 24G2 in terms of response times, which definitely is a good thing. And the high refresh rate improves the overall motion clarity quite a bit, making this a nice little upgrade over the second version 24G2 when it comes to gaming. AOC also gave their 24G2ZU a backlight strobing mode, and they actually did a pretty decent job here. The intensity, or rather the strobe length, can be adjusted from 1 to 20, which is much more adjustment range than many other monitors offer. I found the sweet spot to be around MBR 10. Obviously, higher MBR values lead to even more motion clarity. But keep in mind that this always is a compromise between brightness and motion clarity. While 156 nits will be enough for many people in a normally lit room, 40 nits are only really useful in a pitch black room. And the clarity at around MBR 10 is pretty good already, so this definitely is a good compromise and a useful strobing mode. Crosstalk looks alright as well. Naturally, towards the bottom and the top of the screen, ghost images will start to appear, but the 24G2ZU does a decent job in the mid-screen area. Now here I selected some of the best backlight strobing monitors I've tested so far, and the AOC really doesn't look bad in comparison. The others generally can reach higher brightness levels while strobing and have a more effective blur reduction. And they generally have less crosstalk, but let's not forget that avoiding crosstalk is much harder at 240 Hz than at 144 Hz. So the 144 Hz strobing performance of the 24G2ZU looks a bit cleaner in that regard. By the way, if you like all these UFO photos, I usually shoot a bunch more, like from additional refresh rates and modes and whatnot that often don't really fit into the final video. And those are available at my Patreon in case you're a big monitor nerd and want to see those, or just support what I do. Now, before coming to a conclusion, I briefly need to address coil whine. This is a high-frequency noise that recently seems to become a much more common problem with monitors. And my sample of the 24G2ZU does emit such a high-pitched noise for refresh rates of around 200 Hz and above. It's pretty quiet and not audible with a bit of background noise, but it's there nevertheless. Now, this does not mean that every single 24G2ZU has audible coil whine. I have just tested a single sample connected to a 230 volts 50 Hz grid, and therefore I simply don't know whether every single unit does this, or if it's just like 1 out of every 10 or maybe even 1 out of thousands. If you have a 24G2ZU, please leave a comment below if yours has coil whine or not, for us to get an idea of how common of a problem this actually is. Now, to come back to the initial question of whether the 24G2ZU basically obliterates the entire 144Hz class, I have to say that it definitely gives the more expensive 144Hz monitors a run for their money. I couldn't find US prices, so I'm basing this on Euro prices instead, but this definitely is not much more expensive than some of the 144Hz class monitors. So you might be tempted to spend a few bucks more and get this 240Hz monitor instead of something like the Mobius EX2510, which is one of the bit more pricey 144Hz monitors. And if all you care is high refresh rate gaming north of 144 FPS, this might actually be a good idea. The 24G2ZU gives you that motion blur advantage at 240Hz, and at 144Hz it looks as good as the EX2510, so there's really no drawback for high refresh rate gaming. Therefore, I prefer the 24G2ZU for competitive FPS. Though it's not as versatile of a monitor as the EX2510, which I prefer for pretty much everything else other than competitive gaming. The EX2510 has the edge when it comes to photo or video editing, content consumption, or overall usability. The 24G2ZU is an upgrade for high refresh rate FPS, but a downgrade for pretty much anything else. If I were to rank it into the video about the best 1080p monitors that I just recently made, the 24G2ZU would become one of my top recommendations for tryhards and competitive gaming though. It surely makes it even harder to justify getting the Zowie XL2411K, and it probably would have taken its place in the video if I had tested the AOC before the making. I'll link that video on screen in case you haven't seen that. Thanks for watching, bis zum nächsten Video.